All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Jenny Reese, Nebraska Extension Educator. It's great to be back here and see so many people at this conference. And it's great also to see all the networking because I actually met Jay at this conference, I don't know, 2017 or 2018. But it's a great way to network and meet other people. So with me on this panel today are Jay Gertson, a farmer from York County. He's been interseeding cover crops for 4 years, and Chad Dane, a farmer in Clay County, who's been interseeding cover crops for 3 years. And I'm just so blessed to get to work with so many farmers who let me walk alongside of them, learn with them about the questions that they have in their own fields. So when we're talking about interseeding, why are people interested in interseeding? Well, primarily interseeding of cover crops, what we're talking about is interseeding in early season corn and soybeans. So V3 to V4 corn. For soybeans, we tested at emergence on soybeans and at V2. So ultimately, we would recommend in soybean at planting, at emergence, or a dormant seeding when it comes to soybeans. But why are we doing this? Because we know that that window after corn and soybean harvest is so short. So for those who are looking to get more diversity in the system, it's harder to have anything beyond cereal rye. And so I'm so grateful that we had a great group of growers that looked at this. Their goals can differ depending on their specific operations. It may be to increase nitrogen, allow for weed control, reduce their nutrient inputs in their system, increase diversity, allow for more cover crop growth for forages. So, and then I'm going to put at the bottom, this was my dream. I can't say this is everybody's dream, but it was my dream. My dream was to have something always growing in between the corn or the soybean rows. And it looks very different. It's a very different way of thinking to go down this road. But as I talk with farmers and as we look at the challenges we're facing, possible greater regulations, the difficulty finding chemicals, I think more farmers are interested in finding ways to reduce inputs in their system. So this is a way we were trying to do that. You heard Jay speak, I think 2019 or 2020 at this conference about his work with interseeding that first year. I'm thankful to Katja and the committee for inviting us back to share what happened 3 to 4 years later. But this ended up being a partnership 2020 through 2022 between the Nature Conservancy, the Upper Big Blue NRD, Extension, Kellogg's, and then all of our farmer cooperators. We had 11 farmer cooperators throughout the duration of the 3 years. 6 of them chose to do this via on-farm research, where they maintain the same strips of cover crops and check in their fields throughout the duration of the 3 years. And I have lots of pictures of people because we did a lot of data collection. I'm so grateful to all my colleagues at the university, both current and former colleagues who helped, to Dr. Mary Dranowski, Dr. Darren Redfern for the use of their grad students who helped us so much, and then all of our partners who helped. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists to share their experiences. So we're going to start with Jay Gertson.
Okay, so good morning. Yeah, Jay Gertson. I'll just start out a little bit with telling you guys where I'm at. I'm in Henderson, Nebraska. We are fully irrigated, 2/3 corn, 1/3 soybeans, kind of a rotation. I'm wide row, ridge till, silt loam soils, and there's kind of average yields for the area, field wide on a decent year. So I think Jenny touched on some of these goals. The biggest goal that I had was learning about soil health. Everything I read, everything I listened to, everybody kept coming back to this idea of diversity. And as you can see, I'm growing a fair amount of acres that are corn on corn with that 2/3, 1/3. So the acres I'm putting these interseeded crops on, some of them are 20 to 30 plus years of corn. And it's that way because I rent. I don't there's some logistic stuff that goes on in there, but I was just trying to figure out how can I get something else in here with the corn so that I can keep growing corn, keep doing what we've been doing, keep everybody happy, but also maybe start making an influence on the microbial biomass as well. So I started up there on the top left was my first trial. The first year I did it, I went and stole row units off of a drill that I owned with my cousin, and then a neighbor had a Gandy box sitting around, and I had a cultivator bar. So I spent a couple days slopping that together, and it worked really good. And I was super excited. I actually had like a 2-bushel yield increase, which according to UNL doesn't matter, but it mattered to me, and I thought that was pretty cool. It didn't go down. So, and no offense, statistically. So anyway, I don't understand all the statistics part, but I thought that was cool. So the next winter, I spent all winter building the picture there, the little bigger picture of a 12 row to match my equipment, my size, everything, and because I believed it would work. And then the bottom picture there is an old stock chopper where I moved the row units over to actually go in between the row. And I think that's where the future of this is for me, is using this interseeder to even plant rye or something ahead of soybeans so that I can go in there and rather than using herbicide, I can go out there and terminate my rye by rolling it and then reduce my herbicide even further. I've done it once semi-successfully, and the results were pretty exciting. So one of the main things that I looked at too was I was coming at the point where I thought this might be something that would increase value for the grazer. I don't personally have cattle, but I thought, well, maybe I can entice people to pay me a little extra for my corn stalks if I can raise something for them. And I have another neighbor who does have cattle, and he does a population study every year, and he wanted me to interseed it. So we interseeded it, and just to kind of show you the difference of what sunlight does. The left one there is 10,000 population. And you can see he has Milo in the mix, and it looks like Milo. And you go down to 15,000, it's kind of hard to see in the picture, but it looked kind of like a funny looking grass. And then you get down to 20,000, you can't really even tell that it's Milo anymore. Just that if you want to get biomass, you're going to give up corn population. This is on my own acres, just comparing a dryland corner where I reduced rates 24,000 versus under the pivot where it's 30,000, and just to see the difference in how much growth there is and how that is a direct relation to your population. This is what happened on the second year after I got all excited after that first year. I went out and seeded 300 acres, and one of the quarters happened to have a number that had really good ear flex and really good yield potential. So I dropped the population down, was pretty excited about planting into that, but it also did not have a very good green snap rating. We had a windstorm, and I had about 40% green snap. That field turned into a jungle. That opened up the canopy, the cover crops took off. You could not walk through the field. I mean, it was a mess. Still yielded 165, but it wasn't much fun. On the right side there is that same year on a field where it didn't green snap. The stuff stood up pretty well, but just to show you how much growth we had cowpeas going all the way to the top. They were, in some fields, they were trellising across the 36-inch rows, and you're walking like through head-high soybeans. It was just hard to walk through the field. But it didn't hurt yield that bad where I didn't have the green snap issue. This was just kind of showing what it looks like in the fall and the spring. There was not as much that survived as I was hoping. I was hoping I could use this as a way to take place of my planting cereal rye after corn or after soybeans, late in the season, that I could get a really good established crop early. But it seemed like by harvest time, most of that stuff had died off. And then when you ran shredding corn head over the top of it, you took care of a lot of the rest of it. There was a little bit of green you can see out there in October. The most exciting one was in the springtime. One of my mixes had some cereal clover, I had 6 pounds of cereal rye and 1 pound of sweet clover. And most of what you see out there is actually the sweet clover. It's not the cereal rye. And there's a close-up picture of what those roots are doing. There's a lot of nodulation going on, and that was just 1 pound. So that was exciting to see. I do know that some of the other people in the group had a hard time killing that stuff. Sweet clover is pretty hard to kill. I did not have an issue. It was going into a bean field, and I used dicamba, and it did die for me. But I know some guys hit it 2 or 3 times and still couldn't get it to die. One of the other years, I played with herbicide options. I'm set up to band on my planter, being a ridge-till guy. So I did some playing with banding of generic Lexar. I also did, so if I would band, I would band with the planter, and then I would spray Roundup or Liberty 1 to 2 days before I planted my interseeding, and that's all I had to clean it up. And then, so the middle of the row really never got a pre-emerge that whole season. And then let's see, the second year I did 2 quarts of generic Lexar at planting, and I broadcast it. And then about 4 weeks later is when I came in and interseeded. That worked as well too. You could, however, see that it reduced the population of my, what came up in that interseeded in those strips because of that, probably because of the Callisto and the metolachlor that's in there. And then this last year, I did a broadcast of Verdict, which is a mixture of Outlook and Sharpen. I did that right before the corn was coming up. And then I interseeded about 3 weeks later, and there was no other spray on that field. So that was actually a really cheap herbicide plan for that last year. In fact, when I was going back through and splitting up expenses with my landlords, I couldn't figure out where my second spray had gone on that field. And I remembered what had happened. So it actually worked pretty good, and it is working at actually reducing herbicide costs if you plan accordingly. This is a picture that goes back with the herbicide stuff. So all the way on the left, that's where I had used, I think it was the 2 quarts of Lexar. So you can see that there's not as much diversity in there as if you look way over on the right where there was nothing. On the right there, you can see some radish and stuff like that up front, small seeded. That stuff was knocked out by the herbicide. And on the left here, you're basically seeing some grass, some cowpeas, and there's some flax in there. So just to kind of show as you move that way, there was less herbicide in the mix. So it did, but what was interesting though was that even with that pretty high rate of herbicide, stuff did come up, and it came up through it. And I think that just running that drill unit through there was enough disturbance to break that the barrier or whatever that pre-emerge is putting down, that it still allows stuff to come through. So we were excited about that. Does not mean you have to give up herbicides in order to try this. You just have to be a little more creative. So my mix currently, the one I used last year, and we'll probably use something like it this year. This is what it is if you guys want to see it. Last year was about $15.50. But that's what I'm using. I'm using five plants. I may add annual ryegrass into there too. At this point, I'm not really sure. But so that's kind of what I'm doing. I'm doing low rates. I know if a guy were to be grazing, or if you wanted to get more to make it over the winter time, you would have to bump your rates. But logistically, because of the seeder I'm using, because of the timing this is going in, and because of the fact that this is kind of could potentially compete with my cash crop, I want to keep my rates low in case we have a windstorm or something like that. There's just not quite as much competition out there. Okay, so kind of to sum it up, I did pros and cons, basically positives and challenges. This adds a lot of diversity, and that was one of my main goals, was getting stuff out there, getting other roots out there. And the first year I did this, I didn't know what would grow in the shade of a corn row. I was really, really surprised. I think I tried probably 15 different species that first year, and then had a really hard time figuring out what they were when they came up. But they almost all came up, and that was the cool thing, how much diversity there really was. The interseeder tool opens a lot of options for me. It opened the option for relay cropping, if some of you guys have heard about that. Putting rye and then soybeans, and then harvesting the rye over the top of the soybeans and letting the soybeans come up. It's just kind of a spin on the double crop idea, but it allows you to get better crop of your soybeans. There's just things you can do because you're planting where you're placing your seeds. It kind of opens some different ideas up there. Perennial cover crops, I think that's the next route that I will be exploring, seeing if we can get some clovers or something like that to grow all year round, so I don't have to go out there and try to terminate something in the spring if it overwinters. The diversity, I'm hoping it can eliminate my need for insecticide and fungicide. As a practice, I don't use either one of them, but I will if I need to. But what we saw these last 4 years was how much more insect activity there was in these fields. And we saw spots where when the rootworm beetles come in and start clipping your silks to the row where there was cover crops, they were eating the cover crop instead of clipping corn silks. Now, I can't say that they would do this, overall, but that's what we saw. And Jenny was in, 6 different cooperators' fields. She saw the same thing everywhere, that the bugs they were eating, or the grasshopper, we saw it with grasshoppers too. There'd be cover crop species that were stripped all the way clean. And then you go over into the corn where there was no cover crop, and then they were chewing on the corn. So it adds something else out there, a different food source for them. It also brought in beneficials, stuff like that. Some of that stuff was hard to measure and actually put data to, but it was stuff that we observed and we saw it in person. I think it's a positive for grazing. I don't think there's a huge benefit to it, but the neighbor of mine who has cattle said even just a little bit of green out there with that corn stalks really makes them use the corn stalks a lot more efficiently. And so he thought that even with that small amount of growth we got, that it was still a very positive thing to have out there. So it's something that it was exciting that way too. I had watermark sensors for 3 years in my interseeded strip versus a no treatment strip. And every year it showed that the stuff that had cover crop in it used less water. 3 years in a row. It's under a pivot, but I was monitoring that, and the data showed it. And the last thing was an increased organic matter. And I'll put with a little caveat. There were a few other practices I was doing, and the organic matter increased across all treatments, including the check strip. So it's a little bit, not quite sure why that happened, but it was almost a whole point in 3 years. And I went out and double checked it because I didn't believe it. And the second test I did also showed it as well. So there's potential for something to happen. The challenges, controlling weeds can be a challenge because you do have to think through your herbicides. When you're using a diverse mix like I was, that pretty much takes every single herbicide off the table, unless you can place that herbicide far enough in advance, you just have to be creative. You got to really think it through and realize that it's a balancing act. The weeds that we did have, when we had a good establishment of cover crops, they didn't compete. They were there, but they didn't get big. And you go in the check strip, they got, the water hemp, whatever, we get this big. You go on the interseeded stuff, it stayed as big as the interseeded stuff. It just never got big. So, the herbicide choices and timing is complicated. Those spring pictures you guys could see, it looks like a mess. It's not real pretty to look at sometimes. To me, I like it, but some people, if you're renting ground like me, you may have to talk to your landlords a little bit and try to explain what you're doing, why you're doing it. Wind and hail can get pretty interesting. So make sure that you know what you're planting and that it's a good standing variety, so that you're not putting something with potential green snap in with something that could take off and become a weed. Does take a little bit of creativity to pencil it out financially. At this point, it's pretty hard to make that all make sense if you're just looking at a book standpoint. But when you start factoring in the insect stuff, the possible beneficials, the possible soil health metrics that maybe we can't measure, or we don't know how to make that thing tell us that we can use less fertilizer. Some of those things are kind of hard to figure out exactly that way. There was not as much biomass that was presented that overwintered as what I had hoped for. And there was not probably as much grazing value as I had anticipated. I think that's the end of mine. I'll let Chad take over.
Good morning. I realized I hadn't been up here for 28 years. I started doing the math. I worked a summer up here across the road for UNL as a senior. And that was 1995. So that tells you how old I am already. But my name's Chad Dana, farm in Clay County. We farm just shy of 4,000 acres. Corn, soybeans, we have about 1,000 acres of seed corn. Takes a lot of our time. My wife and I have 7 children. So if we're not in the field, we are in a gymnasium, which is where I'm headed after this. So I don't speak a lot. Jay's going to be a lot longer than I was or will be. Let's see where to start. So I guess we've been growing cover crops for 12 years. Kind of started when we were doing seed corn, and growing cover crops and seed corn is pretty easy. Lots of sunlight. And we've had a green snap or hail event 11 years in a row now on our seed corn, amazingly enough. So we have lots of sunlight. That's the easy part. We tried growing cover crops in field corn numerous times. It's not that you can't get established. You can fly seed on. It will establish. The problem is sunlight. And the cover crops get tall and spindly. They fall over in the first event of hot weather, say in September when you're done irrigating, they die off. So you spend a lot of money to no avail. We've even done it with a 40% green snap in field corn, flown turnips and radishes on. They did not develop correctly. So when Jenny called and said, hey, would you be interested in this? Well, sure. Anytime we could establish something early so that plant develops correctly, let it go dormant, and then see if it comes on in the fall. Like, you bet, that sounds great. So I've only done it for 3 years. And I guess my goal was to, I don't have cattle. Cash rents in my area are pretty high. It's pretty intense. So it's all about economics. I guess my goal was to reduce nitrogen cost if we could, hopefully to see an organic matter increase. And of course, soil erosion. I will say, before I go into this mix, one thing we have found in our area, Clay County is named that for a reason. We do have some heavy, heavy clay. And even drilling rye after corn harvest, if you can let that get 8 to 10 inches tall the next spring and kill it off, which it maybe not even plant green, we have found with all of our water sensors that we are getting a deeper penetration with all our irrigation and rain. Just that little bit. We've had some farms that were gravity irrigated for far too long that we took over, and water was only soaking 18 inches deep first 2 years. And after some rye, our water goes down 4 feet when we irrigate, and our roots go down 4 feet. We were seeing on our sensors the root mass wasn't even there past 24 inches. So certain benefits. But I'm getting off subject there, Jenny. So mine, I'm gonna tell you, I don't even know what my mix was. I said, Jenny, I want a nitrogen building mix. And so she helped me with all the work. So you can see everything there. There's our 21 mix and our 22. And yeah, the 21 mix, you look at the cost at $46 an acre. That's really, after the first year, I said, listen, we can't, not too many farmers are going to pay that kind of money. That's a big outlay to, especially, let's say if we could make 50 pounds of nitrogen, even at $1 a pound, which, you're a break even there. So 2022, that got reduced to $22 an acre. And so that's more reasonable for our goals. Herbicides. So yeah, this is a timing thing. So to get cover crops seeded in corn, we use the NRD's drill. I didn't build one like Jay. Two leaf, you can start going and probably planting at 2-leaf corn. 5-leaf corn, you're almost too late. By 6-leaf corn, if you're interseeding, we've seen that the corn's too big already. You will not get established. So you've got about an 8 to 10 day window in there to get this done, which is doable if you get the weather. Our pre-emerges were some atrazine and metolachlor, Roundup. Our post was Roundup and Liberty. I think all 3 years. We just posted it either the day they planted or a couple days after, before the cover crop came up, or the day before. We did 1.75 quarts of Lexar and 1.8 quarts of Lexar. So yeah, even with the Callisto in there, you can get a good establishment of cover crop, which was nice to see. And honestly, our weed control was fine in both the seeded and unseeded. And so these strips, we did them 3 years in a row on the very same strips. And so our goal is to, and I'm going to let Jenny talk about what we saw on the soil tests after 3 years. But early season and mid season, yeah, I know that we got good establishment. Mid season, you can see that we had great covers. Some of the cowpeas and the they call forage beans. Is that the other bean? And the buckwheat had gotten up pretty tall, and I thought, boy, this is going to be bad on a corn head. You know, we're not going to get through this. But by harvest time, you didn't even notice it. They were there. They had dried up just like the corn plant. Corn head went through no problem. Yeah, excellent weed control. Good cover. Here's the fall, and really, the guys with a cow herd, I think, could take advantage of something like this. You know, there's some growth there. This is October. I don't know when that picture was taken, but that's mid-October, and you can see we got some good cover there. And it grew for another 2 weeks before it froze, and so we're really happy with the results. Now in year 3 this year, we had, let's see, Pioneer 1563. That's a very tall, bushy plant. And the early season looked just like that. By late season, when did we go there? Mid-August, late August, September, 1st September. There was hardly anything in my plot. I hadn't been in there for 2 weeks. I couldn't believe it. A lot of it died off. That's just too big a plant. Okay, so there is a little bit to picking the right corn hybrid too, I believe. We did do 1 year a soybean mix and did some winter wheat and clover. And the soybeans were planted into green cereal rye that spring. And then we killed that with Roundup, Valor, and Zidua. And then we did no herbicide on the plot. And so there's after we drilled the wheat and clover. Came up nicely. And as you would expect, irrigated soybeans, they get chest high. Zero sunlight gets in there. The wheat died off, but I don't know if we have a picture of the clover stayed living. And it was nodulating. And we only did that 1 year. So there is potential there. Trying to think what else. I guess for me, 3 years, were we successful? Did we learn anything? Yes, we're increasing the bugs in our soil. Without a doubt, you're increasing or helping soil erosion. In a picture like that on the right, if you've got any kind of rolling fields, you get a pouring rain, without a doubt, you're decreasing soil loss. So that's a benefit. It's a challenge. It's a timing challenge. After 3 years, we need to keep going. We're probably going to plant soybeans in this field this year and not do anything different. See if we'll go ahead and measure those strips again and just see if after 3 years there was a benefit. And then I think what I'd like to do, as Jay mentioned, it's such a timing issue. To cover a couple thousand acres of this would be very difficult. I think we need to get to more of a solid seeded clover, run a strip till machine through it, maybe ban herbicide, and try to plant in that same spot for 5 or 6 years and maintain that clover in between the rows and cut our herbicide costs. See if we can actually cut our nitrogen down by 80 pounds or something. Then we're talking some real benefits. So, yeah, that's about it for me.
So I'm going to finish up with a summary. of what we learned in our 6 on-farm research fields. So we had 6 on-farm research fields, but we had July 9th, 2020 and 2021, we had the windstorms that impacted yields. June 14th, 2022 was a massive hailstorm in our area of the state. So we only had 2 fields that made it to harvest last year. We also had 2 soybean studies where they were interseeded in 2021. So instead of showing you a bunch of graphs, because I could spend a lot of time on graphs, I just want to give you the overall summary and then share where we're going to go, what we learned and where we're going to go from here. So we had a total of 12 corn site years and 2 soybean site years. We took cover crop biomass every year in September. 10 of the 12 site years, the interseeded cover crop had more biomass than the check. There were 2 times where the check treatment, that was in 2020, where the canopy had 40 to 45% green snap, opened it up. We had more weeds in those check strips than we actually had even cover crop in the interseeded area. And that's just because we had no residual herbicide. We used the same herbicide program across the entire area of this plot. When it came to yield, half of the sites, so 6 of the 12 years, we had higher yield in the check treatment than the interseeded. In half the years, we had no difference. So those yields ranged from 2 bushels an acre to 10 bushel an acre under that check. When it came to the soybeans, we had no difference in the yield where we interseeded. So those 2 locations, no difference in yield. Net return, 10 of the 12 site years for corn, we had a higher net return for the check. And going back to Jay's point, in that, we're basically looking at the cost of the cover crop and the cost to interseed. We're not taking into account any other benefits. So half the guys grazed their fields. We didn't take any account for any changes in soil health benefits for less insecticides or fungicides. So those are things that we need to think about as a soil, like a community around soil health. How do we attribute economics to these factors? We hope to do that more in the future with our group. Soil health values. We took PLFA, so phospholipid fatty acid analysis. That's your soil microbes. So that looks at total microbial biomass as well as how much is bacteria versus fungal. And then we also did the Haney test. So we did this in 2020, and then we did it again in 2022. Both the same time of the year, the same way of sampling. And what we found was a significant increase from 2020 to 2022 of all the soil health indicators in the check, as well as it happened in the interseeded. So when we look at overall, when we compare the check to the interseeded, we can't say that the difference in that increase in the microbial growth in the soil health indicators was due to the interseeding itself. So then I'm getting these results back, scratching my head, and I start asking them all more questions. These guys are already doing a lot of practices, soil health practices that many of you in the room are probably already doing. So they were maintaining everything correctly on their strips. But like Chad, he drills rye across his whole field every fall and was grazing. And Jay was doing that on several times, and he also was using compost extract in his field. We had another guy applying a biological across his field that I found out after the study. So they're all doing additional things to increase soil health. So the good news for all these guys, they all significantly improved their soil health in 3 years. It's just we can't attribute all of that to the interseeding itself. And then we also took the soil nutrient values, and there were individual changes, but across the board, we didn't see any differences. This is just a picture, Jay. This is actually from your field to show red ripper cowpeas when you open up that canopy, what it does. And Steve Melvin is my colleague with UNL that's been working with me on these studies as well. You can see how great of nitrogen fixers those cowpeas are as well. What I was excited about was what I feel that our group achieved is we were able to prove that we can interseed cover crops into early season corn and soybeans successfully. So we were able to get establishment, we were able to get growth. They survived the growing season. We had something at harvest, and then we also had something that survived the winter. And how much survived the winter depended on what the rate was and what the species were and how the winter was. If it was a dry, open winter, you didn't have as much survival. If you had snow cover, you had a lot more survival. And so these are just examples. We've got red clover, hairy vetch, yellow sweet clover. This was really cool until it gets really scary. Like, when you start realizing, oh my goodness, like we're throwing so much herbicide at this thing and it's not dying. I have a whole presentation just on herbicides. So all this information will be in Crop Watch. We'll have like 4 articles in Crop Watch because that's how much we've learned. But the clover, though, is what really encouraged us. How this survived really encouraged us for where we're going. I've got 2 slides on what we learned. I'm not going to go through all of this. If you want to take pictures, you can do that. But I put it on here so that you could just see the summary. A lot of this was covered between the 3 of us already. One thing that wasn't covered is we do need to think about water early on in that season. So if we've got a dry spring, got to think about maybe an inch of either rainfall or irrigation. And the irrigation, we were splitting it into 1/2 inch passes because you've really got to have something to get those seeds that are just at the surface or just below the surface getting going early on in that season. And then everything else. So we also saw that with the Japanese beetles regarding the insects. So Jay mentioned the insects part of it. This next slide, what we learned, buckwheat and flax, it just became pollinator sanctuaries out there, just butterfly sanctuaries, lacewings, dragonflies. It was beautiful. It's really, it looks different, but it's just beautiful. If I'm to recommend what you want in your interseeded mix, I'm always going to say, especially in corn on corn, buckwheat, cowpeas, flax, and then collards, like a forage collard, and then annual or Italian ryegrass, or both of them. The reason, buckwheat and cowpea, they're going to be your first things up. They come up quick, 3 to 5 days. They get a broad leaf, and I really think that helps us with weed control. It shades the ground quick. Forage collars provide your understory, or you can use other brassicas too. We just started switching to forage collards. And they also, I felt, helped with weed control. I already talked about the yellow sweet clover. And this key I mentioned at the beginning, but if you're going to do this in soybeans, the earlier the better. So interseed at planting, at emergence, or do a dormant seeding. Hybrid is important. So both of these guys actually used Pioneer 1563, and they both learned, and it's a great hybrid, and it's a great flex hybrid too. But when you're using these really tall, really broad-leafed hybrids, we got to think about what else we're trying to achieve within those rows. So be thinking about your hybrids when you're doing this as well. And then I took a ton of soil samples, and I wasn't smart enough early on, but that's how we learn. I could never figure out where all the nitrogen was, where are all the nutrients. Took all these soil samples, and there was always less nutrients where we interseeded versus what the check treatments were. Well, the nutrients are all in the plants. So if you're going to be doing nutrient analysis in these cover crop studies, take the nutrient analysis, take biomass samples, send them to places like wards, and have them do the nutrient analysis for you. So we started doing that the last 2 years because our guys wanted to know how much nitrogen is this cover crop providing me for the next season. So that was an additional thing that we started using. I wish I would have known that sooner. So where are we going? We got excited about clover. And it's because after interseeding into soybeans, which I was excited, but I was kind of scared. And we had to plan A through E on what to do for herbicide options. And the last one, E, was we were going to abandon the whole thing. But I'm so grateful that these growers are just willing to just take that risk, jump in and take those risks with me. But after we saw how the red clover got established in soybeans, it was just really cool because we're like, we already have that crop then established for the corn that's going in there the next year. So we're switching now our mindset a little bit to perennial covers. Last year, we started with 6 fields that were dormant seeded. So when I'm saying dormant seeding, this is in March using the interseeder. So we dormant seeded in March. We did red clover. Some guys did Dutch white clover. So think about the white clover in your lawns that's low growing, hard to kill. That's Dutch white clover. That's what we're going to start putting in fields. Actually, we're going to go to Aberlasting this year, which is a mix of Dutch white times Cura clover. And the reason for that is it has a little bit more drought tolerance, really good grazing. So this is one of the fields that survived. This is in corn. We love the way that this looked. This is mammoth red clover, got 2 feet tall, and then just laid down. An amazing weed control. We compared the economics of this compared to a full herbicide treatment in his check strips. And basically this, all it has is clethodim to kill the rye, 2 rounds of Zidua. So when you're thinking about working with cover crops, you really have to start thinking outside the box with herbicides. And we're just using a lot of group 15s after the covers are emerged. So we're excited about this. This is what it looked like after running a strip till rig in it this fall. And so we're excited to see what it looks like next year with soybeans. This was soybeans. It looks like a mess. Again, it's a different way of thinking. It looks very different. This looks kind of scary when you get clover that's that tall growing with your soybeans. This is what it looked like at harvest and after harvest. And then that's what it looks like today. So we're just excited to look at the economics of the system and see, okay, now we've got the clover established. How well does it come back? And over time, what are the economics of, okay, if we're not reseeding, we've got that cost gone. Can we reduce our herbicide? Can we reduce our nitrogen in the system? And I think that's of interest to us. That's where I'm not saying that we're not going to interseed annuals too, but this is what several of the guys are excited about. I'm going to give a plug for our on-farm research meetings. If you want to hear more about these and other studies, these are the different locations, and we're asking that you would RSVP. And with that, I'm going to just turn it over, open it up for questions that you have for us. Okay, the question is, what's the current status with crop insurance with interseeding cover crops? So when I look at the RCIS policies, technically it is legal to do this. But then you read further and it talks about it's based on what your local NRCS region dictates, especially when it comes to planting green and termination, things like that. So according to RCIS, when you read it, the big policy, you can do it. But then you got also, I mean, there's the NRCS part of it. And at the end of the day, I'll let these guys talk about what they see on it. I will say we did a lot of interseeding in other situations, including after a hailstorm, when a guy was down to 10,000 plants. And what we did is we interseeded a cover crop mix in a portion of his field, and then he left a check strip because his crop insurance guy wasn't sure about the whole thing. To the row where we had interseeded the cover crops, Palmer didn't come in. Palmer came in crazy where the hail damage was without. So, I mean, that is something to also consider in these situations.
Yeah, I did talk to my insurance guys before I did it. I thought about not talking to them, but then I wondered what would happen. But yeah, like she said, I mean, according to the big main policy, I don't remember the wording, but I did look it up specifically, and I think there were some conversations with here, but look at the policy. This is what it says, and it's worded that it is inclusive, the way I understood it.
Yeah, I asked my guy, and he just said, go ahead, it's legal. I think that's changed recently. And seed corn companies are now paying us extra to plant cover crops as part of their contract. So I think in the future, these things will be more normal.
I have a couple questions. Have you done any research with grilled soybeans? And also, are you using any residual chemicals for weed control?
I guess I didn't catch I didn't do any soybean stuff myself, but as far as the residuals, I mean, we definitely did use residuals. We used them. What I did was finding that, if you could wait 3 weeks or something after that residual, you had the better stand. But we also, this last year, some of the guys who got the perennials going were using residual like metolachlor or Zidua on top of the emerged clover. So to give you that residual, but after that cover crop has already come up, but to keep the other stuff from coming.
And I didn't catch the first part of your question. What kind of soybeans? Oh, drilled soybeans. Okay. So on the soybean study, Chad had 30-inch rows.
No, I'm talking like 15 to 7.5.
Right. So Chad had 30-inch rows, but the other guy who did the soybeans was in 15-inch rows. And so on that one, he farms tough ground. That field is some tough ground. And I was concerned about, he had a beautiful stand of 15-inch soybeans, and we were going to interseed through there. And I knew we were going to kill soybeans along the way. So we actually added a half rate of soybeans into our wheat and our clover mix just to make sure that we could have enough cover, because had a lot of terrain on that ground. It turned out amazing.
Kudos to you, Jenny, and Chad and Jay for sharing. And it's truly innovative work that you're doing with interseeding and sharing the replicated results. Kudos to you guys today. Has there in central Nebraska been any new farmer-to-farmer learning communities? Because it takes, you got to up your game management-wise and your herbicide talk and their experiences. They're willing to share farmer-to-farmer here. Is there any new groups that have started in your area that are willing to share results with cover crops? Because really in Nebraska, we only have maybe 4 or 5% cover crops totally, across the state. That might be generous at that, but I see this as a new opportunity for farmers to learn amongst themselves, those that are leaders in their area.
There is a kind of a small group of people that we've been meeting, and not like taking data necessarily, but just sharing experiences. And I think that started because there were probably 10 or 12 of us that were all bugging Jenny about, well, who are the other people that are trying this stuff? And so she kind of connected some dots and put some names together. And so there's a few of you in this room and a few others that, within probably a 50-mile radius of York or so that are meeting. And I would encourage anybody, wherever part of the state that you are, if you find a few other people who are trying some different things or whatever, just to talk to other people, because then you're not alone doing it, and also helps you when you make mistakes, or you can learn from somebody else's mistakes or share your own or whatever. And it's not the same. You don't get the same judgment that you would at the coffee shop.
I guess I'll just add to that I guess the biggest challenge for me is herbicides and trusting that you can back off. I've got a father who sees one sunflower in the ditch and he's making a phone call to me, get your corn knife out. And my grandfather was even worse. So this is a whole different, you got to have a landlord willing to see these things and, hey, this is something different. So for me, backing off herbicides is what I want to learn, and trusting that in the future.
So what was the big concern in the green snap corn? Because in my mind, you're either going to have a cover crop kind of explode and take over, that's going to freeze out and not really be in my thought, maybe not a major problem. But if you don't, at least in my area, and it was mentioned, Palmer will go freaking nuts, and it'll be a problem at harvest time, even after they're dead, where the other ones are probably going to melt for the most part.
And that's a good point. And that I hadn't, that year that happened, I mean, that was the first time I'd had that bad of hail or wind, I guess, in quite a while. And the other experiences had been like, replanting hail. So that, there you don't have that comparison. But that is a good point on the Palmer thing, that the fact that stuff took off, it did keep the weeds at bay. It's just that those became weeds. And I did question that year how much of my yield loss was because of hail and how much, I keep saying hail, wind, because that's what I had this year. Yeah, it was hail. Was the wind was how much of it was due to the covers actually stealing nitrogen? Because I think at that point, when they started getting that big, they were competing with the corn. They were competing, and where I had check strips, the yield difference was definitely bigger that year between my check strips and my cover crop because of that. I think that just that competition that was there, but it did keep the weeds out. You were correct.
How much opportunity is there to increase your grazing fees and offset some of the costs?
I come from I do not have cattle, didn't grow up with cattle. And the guys that I deal with that have cattle either have their own ground or they don't want to pay any extra. So I think it's hard to convey that benefit, especially because I'm not doing it myself saying, yeah, I've done the one neighbor that I did some interseeding for, he did some strip trials, and he found that whether it was from the interseeding or just the fact that he was strip grazing, he tripled his time cow per acre, whatever the terminology is there. I mean, he tripled it pretty easily. But that was also, cutting them back and moving fence and doing all that kind of work. And most of the guys that I know who run cattle, they want to fence off a quarter and they don't want to touch it. And even one of the guys that I've talked to, I said, well, I'll move the fence for you. And he was pretty nervous even about that, like, because I wanted to see what it would do. But he didn't even want to let me do the work just because he was worried about the cows.
I can't say I have a lot of experience with that in field corn, but in seed corn, yeah, guys will, excuse me, bring 400 cows and drop them off and come back in a month, and yeah, we've gotten paid up to $30 an acre for some of that. And their pairs, the calves do gain pretty good. They've been happy, I think. But one year then I didn't get paid, so it's kind of like the hay business. And so I think you got to trust who you're working with. And there are some opportunities, but as far as these covers, these were small 15-acre plots. They weren't big enough to justify that yet.
Thank you so much. I think we are out of time. We have another speaker coming up. Thank you to the panel for bringing all of this together, talking about soil health and all these beneficials. Very cool.